Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. I just recently returned from Montreal from the Healthy Dancer Canada conference, and so today we are going to sort of recap and dissect this conference a little bit. I have been doing these recap posts from the last, I'm not even sure how many conferences I've been to, but certainly this year after the IADAMS conference and after the PAMA conference, and I've done them previously before. And I'm always surprised that these episodes are really, really popular when I look at download statistics of, which podcast episodes people seem to be most interested in, or the feedback I get from people who are messaging me or interacting with me. These ones are always really popular, which kind of surprised me at first. I think I did the first one just, on a whim. And then people were like, oh, that was so great. I really like hearing what was going on at conferences that they have not been able to attend. So we're continuing on that tradition today. And I will give you some of my highlights of this conference that I just got back from. For those of you who are maybe not aware, Healthy Dancer Canada is a Canadian organization that promotes dancer health and wellness. And they, I believe, are in their 17th year and have been putting on these conferences pretty consistently over the years. They change locations. And during the pandemic, obviously they went virtual. And this year it was a hybrid conference. So there were people who were in person in Montreal on site, but there were also people who were attending virtually as well. So shout out to all the Healthy Dancer Canada conference committee people, because I cannot imagine the tech that was involved in that, because not only were they dealing with online and in-person attendees, but the conference was actually bilingual this year as well. So some of the presentations were in English, some of the presentations were in French, and so everything was being translated as well. And it was being translated for people who were there in person and being translated for people who were online. So massive shout out to the organizers. I honestly have no idea how they dealt with all of those logistics over the weekend, but it was a great conference. This conference is a much, much smaller scale than maybe some of the other conferences that I have talked about in the past, and certainly IADAMS being the big international association. That conference has gotten really, really, really big, and Healthy Dancer Canada is still on a much smaller scale, and I love that aspect of this conference. It's really easy to get to know what feels like almost all of the participants who are there. I did not have a chance to chat with every single person who was there, but you get to have kind of a little bit more personal and meaningful interactions with the people who are in the room, because it is a much smaller scale. And it just feels like a little bit more intimate. So that is one of the reasons I love this conference. Full disclosure, I used to sit on the board of Healthy Dancer Canada. I've also been the conference coordinator in the past of this conference. So this is an organization that is very near and dear to my heart. And so, perhaps I'm a bit biased about things, but when it comes to actually what we'll recap in terms of the conference presentations and stuff like that, it was a great conference. There was a lot of really good research that was coming out of it. And it was neat to see some of the research that's coming out of Canadian institutions, because especially if you are Canadian, you will know that we don't have a lot of post-secondary dance options within Canada, especially compared to other parts of the world. And so I would not say that we necessarily have post-secondary institutions that are really heavy in dance research. We have the University of Calgary that has traditionally been maybe a little bit more research heavy, because they have I don't think partnership is the right word, but they have a relationship between the School of Kinesiology and the School of Dance. And so there is maybe like a little bit more research that comes from the University of Calgary. But this was really cool because we saw research coming out of like the University of Toronto and the University of Lethbridge and places that we don't necessarily traditionally associate with being dance-related programs. And some of these were really coming out of like social science fields and backgrounds. I'll get into that more in a minute. But I just really loved seeing what was going on in Canada because these are people who I'm not necessarily directly connected with. So that was very, very cool. In terms of the location, it was in Montreal. If you've never been to Montreal, it's a great city. It snowed, so maybe, not my favorite time of year there, but it is such a great city. And they actually held the conference at École Supérieure du Ballet du Québec. Excuse my terrible French accent. And their facilities were fantastic for this. So, big open dance rooms and just it was a really great facility for the conference. And for any of you guys who attend conferences regularly, you will know that the facilities make a big difference. For anybody who was at IADMS this year and had to jog down the 5-mile long hallway to get from one session to another multiple times in a day, it really does make a big difference. And these facilities were absolutely incredible. The other thing that I love about the Healthy Dancer Canada conferences is part of their mandate is to actually bring dance into the conference. And so there are dance performances that are part of the conference. So the attendees get to watch a bunch of different dance performances. This is also part of HDC's sort of focus on supporting dancers within the Canadian dance landscape. And so what they do is similarly to how they have calls for proposals for people to present at the conference, they also put out a call for performances. And so people can submit performance proposals, if that's what you want to call them. And a bunch of people get selected to perform at the conference, and those artists get paid. And that is huge. And that is a really big part of HDC's mandate, is that we want to support dancers to be making livable wages and things like that. And so in this conference, and now I feel like I'm missing one in my brain, but I believe there were 5 performances. A couple of them were virtual again, so they were recorded video performances. And then we had live performances as well. And so we had a Bollywood piece. We had a group of contemporary dancers from the Montreal area who were, I think, mostly graduates of École Supérieure who have put together a company to then perform works throughout the city. And there was also a dance artist who from Filipino heritage who kind of combines street dance with Filipino folk dance. It was so interesting. It was a really, really cool genre of dance. So we had in-person performances as well, which I loved about the conference. All right, enough about me yapping about the kind of logistics of the conference. I want to share a few kind of highlights or things big takeaways that I had with you. So number one, the opening keynote address was from Anique Bissonnette. I think her last name is... Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure it is. I will double check that for the show notes. And she's the director of École Supérieure right now. And she spoke a bit about her own dance journey, but she mostly spoke about kind of taking over the school and where it was at the time and how she has kind of moved it forward and evolved things, and especially from a perspective of dancer health and wellness. They really have a kind of ethos of developing humans, not just dancers, and really trying to take care of dancers' health. And whether that is their mental health, whether that is their physical health, that is really the foundation of what they are trying to build their program on. So she talked about things when she arrived there, their healthcare budget was $5,000, and now they have a budget of, I believe it's something $65,000 maybe or something like that. Anyway, it has increased exponentially. It's obviously probably still not as much money as they would want to deliver the programming that they have, but they have really great programming that is going on. And she talked a lot about the team aspect of that and how that change and shift has really come from the leadership at the school. And so, her coming in, deciding that this is what's really important and meaningful in terms of the direction that the school needed to take, and especially to continue to be successful. And then trickling that down to her teachers and her staff and her faculty. And so that everybody is on the same page and all of the dancers are hearing the same messaging and the same language. And, she had really concrete examples and even things like, when they talk about things with their dancers right from the very beginning, things that are often taboo within, especially the ballet world, like eating disorders and things like that. But they educate their dancers and talk about that right from the very beginning so that if there is a dancer who is struggling, it becomes a much more normalized conversation. Teachers can raise that, sort of red flag or raise awareness, or other students can say, hey, I've noticed that my friend is having trouble with XYZ. So just changing the entire culture of how health and wellness is embraced at that school was so, so, so lovely to hear and really refreshing to hear. And struck me because, and I can't remember what podcast number it was, but was talking, a few months ago about how way too often in the dance world, we expect the dancers or the people at the bottom of the pyramid to sort of be more responsible for change that is happening. So it's well, you should be eating better, or you should be strength training, or all of these things. But really that change needs to come from leadership. And that change will not happen quickly enough or be effective if it is not coming from the top down. It really needs to be coming from leadership and management. And so it was really nice to hear a story from École Supérieure, especially because I've had lots of dancers who I've treated over the years who have ended up going to summer intensives there or going to the graduate program and stuff. And I've always heard really positive things, but then to get to sort of hear firsthand from the people actually working in the program, now I know why my dancers who have gone there have had good experiences. And so, yeah, like I said, it was just cool to sort of see behind the scenes, but also see this leadership in action, that they have put those programs in place and put, just sort of tried to normalize or change the culture to make sure that it is a healthy environment. She had a really lovely kind of anecdote as well, in that their primary mission or goal is to really raise good human beings and train not just dancers, but train them with skills that will be transferable into any, anything that dancer wants to pursue in the future. And she told a story about how she has a graduating student who was very, very promising, a very, very talented dancer, but who reached out and said, hey, I'd like to go into medicine. Can you write me a recommendation letter to apply to medicine? And so she kind of talked about how that makes her equally as happy, if not more so happy, than a dancer who wants to pursue the path of dance, because she knows that all of the skills that they have taught within that institution are transferable and will make that particular person a really talented, physician or whatever aspect of medicine they decide to go into. So I thought that was also a really neat message to hear, because I think so often if dancers or people decide that they don't want to pursue dance at a higher level, a lot of teachers or studio owners or company directors and stuff sometimes take it a bit personally or feel like there's, wasted talent or things like that. But really, at the end of the day, if that's not what that person wants and they are closing that chapter on their dance career and they want to take those skills and transfer them into another field, there's so much value in that as well. So again, to hear that coming from the top down was really, really powerful and refreshing. So that was how we opened the conference, and I thought was a great way to open the weekend. Some other kind of key takeaways. There was actually a little bit I always love sessions that are a little bit kind of peeling back the veil, seeing behind the scenes of things a little bit. So there was a presentation from Charlotte Ballet that talked a little bit about how they have managed to build a healthcare program that honestly sounds like the envy of many, many, many mid-sized companies. So I guess that's also one thing to kind of throw out there as well, is although this conference is called Healthy Dancer Canada, it is open to anyone. There are always international attendees. There are international presenters and things like that. So this is not a Canadian exclusive event. We have members of Healthy Dancer Canada who are from all over the world as well. So like I said, we had the team from Charlotte Ballet come in and talk about how they put out a request for proposals for a healthcare partnership, essentially. And so Charlotte Ballet recognized that they needed to have a healthcare program. They were previously, and probably similar to a lot of kind of small to mid-sized companies, they kind of had, maybe formal or informal agreements with local healthcare providers where their dancers could go to like a local clinic, or maybe like the physical therapist knew a bit about dance or things like that. But they didn't have something on site. They didn't have like a formal partnership. And they recognized that maybe this was something that would be beneficial to their dancers and to their company. And so they put out this request for proposals and got back a couple of proposals, but one in particular that was very robust and that met all the requirements of what they were looking for. And they were looking for not just on-site clinical hours. So they wanted, a physical therapist or an athletic therapist or someone on site. They also wanted educational sessions, and they wanted other things as part of this partnership. And so they got a proposal back, and super interestingly, and I don't know that this would ever happen in Canada because our healthcare system is so different, but this larger American healthcare company came back and said, okay, these are all the things that we can offer you as part of this proposal, and we want to offer it to you for free, essentially, or kind of in kind. So what they actually wanted in exchange was just like marketing. And so they wanted to be listed as the exclusive healthcare provider for Charlotte Ballet. They wanted, some social media posts. They wanted I can't even remember what else, emails, I don't even know. Oh, they wanted some of the dancers to attend their children's hospital around Christmas dressed in Nutcracker costumes to meet with like pediatric patients who were in the hospital, things like that. And so, again, the thing that struck me the most about this program, well, like I said, it sounds like the envy of a lot of other mid-sized companies, because in terms of budget, I don't think most small to mid-sized companies in certainly Canada, but the US as well, would be able to afford the type of robust healthcare program that Charlotte Ballet now has access to with this partnership. But the other thing was that this all came about as a result of Charlotte Ballet being really, really proactive and saying, okay, this is what we want. Let's see what is out there. Let's put out this request. Let's see what we can get in return. And they were not expecting a program to be provided to them in kind. They were fully expecting to be paying for these services, but this healthcare company saw it as an opportunity to use it for publicity and marketing and whatever, and came back and said, we can offer you all of these things, and this is what we want in return, rather than like dollars, which I realize is not going to be the case for every single company out there. But again, I just thought it was such a great example and a really powerful reminder of being proactive rather than reactive, and saying, hey, this is what we think our dancers deserve, and this is what we need as a company. Let's see who out there can help us, provide these services. And you never know what's going to happen. Maybe a company out there says, hey, we're going to do it for free for you. So again, it's not always going to happen like that, but I think it is a great reminder to try and create those relationships and partnerships and put those things out into the universe and see what happens, because from what has happened with Charlotte Ballet, they have a really, really great healthcare program from what it sounds like, in terms of what the dancers have access to. And, there's a lot of components to this program, but they essentially, from what I understand now, have one full-time PT, physical therapist on site, as well as 2 part-time PTs. So that's quite a lot of healthcare for, again, a mid-sized company. I think they're 20 full-time dancers, and then they have like a second company and things like that as well. So again, just a really, really great, clear example of leadership, the, company directors being the people who are putting this in place, rather than waiting till they have a whole bunch of injuries and then being a bit reactive and saying, okay, who can our dancer go see, or how do we structure healthcare, or that type of thing. I thought it was, a really great kind of behind the scenes sneak peek into this. Next highlight, just looking at my list. there was lots of stuff on nutrition. And so there was a panel discussion all about like nourishing, like dancers being well nourished. And then there was a couple of individual podium presentations as well from different dietitians, sports dietitians. And I just thought it was really great, especially in a time where we're seeing a lot of maybe not so great messaging on specifically social media, a lot on TikTok in terms of, you know, fueling and body image and the resurgence of skinny talk and all of that kind of stuff that's going on right now. It was nice to have presentations where everyone was kind of on the same page and presenting very similar information in terms of how we need to fuel our dancers. And so there was one presentation that was more about really just like the culture of food and lots of really concrete tips and examples of how we can create a culture of food that isn't this sort of like, you know, like positive versus negative. Like it's that sort of like all foods fit, and, you know, really creating like healthy boundaries around food and nutrition and how we view it. And so we don't have, you know, good foods and bad foods and cheat days and things like that. And really concrete examples of how you can bring that into the studio or into even your home. Like if you're a parent of a dancer and you want to support them on their dance journey, how can we do that in a way that's not going to create problematic relationships with food? Yeah, just those types of things. So that was really great. And then there was another podium presentation about the nutritional needs of ballet dancers specifically. And to no surprise to anyone, ballet dancers are often underfueled. And so just looking at what the effects of that are on performance and if we can properly or adequately fuel our dancers, how that has such a huge impact on not just their performance, but also like their well-being. So even things like mental health and stuff like that is really impacted by our fueling and nutritional status. So those presentations were all great. I thought it was really nice that there was sort of a whole bunch of stuff that was on that this year. It's always kind of great to, sort of have the same messages sort of being reinforced. So there was, like I said, the panel presentation and then a couple of individual podium presentations that were all on a similar, sort of theme in terms of fueling our dancers. What else? Oh, we had another keynote from, and I'm probably going to pronounce her last name incorrectly, but Barbara Canaratoni Diabo, who is an Indigenous dancer and director of a company in the Montreal area. And it was a really powerful keynote as well. She kind of told her story of growing up both in like an Indigenous culture in terms of learning Indigenous dance, but also training in more kind of Western Eurocentric dance forms. So she is like trained in ballet and things like that as well. And sort of her, just her personal story and her personal journey. But the thing that I really liked about her presentation is she talked a bit about her current company and presented some of her work, like a video of some work that her company has done, which was absolutely stunning. It was so beautiful. But there was in the Q&A afterwards some questions around like if we want to help sustain or promote the Indigenous dance cultures within our communities or within our country and things like that, like what are some things that we as non-Indigenous people can be doing? And she had lots of ideas and some really concrete actionable items, but the thing that struck me so much is she talked about how their communities have been forced off their land for so long. And that to this day means that a lot of these Indigenous dancers or Indigenous dance communities don't actually have facilities to train out of. So a lot of them do not have their own spaces. They don't have a studio space. They don't have places to rehearse. And so that I had never thought about it like that before. Maybe I should have. But it obviously makes so much sense. And so in terms of like actionable items, she was saying like, if you are a studio who has times of the day when your studios are vacant, especially if you run a studio for children and adolescents and most of your classes are in after school times, potentially there might be like a professional Indigenous dance company in your community or area who's looking for studio space or rehearsal space during the day. And so providing access to studio spaces or performance spaces even to these dancers is really, really impactful, because that is often one of the biggest barriers to them being able to continue to dance and to continue to have that part of their culture. So yeah, it was just something I hadn't thought of before, and really just made a whole lot of sense in terms of access to rehearsal spaces. Like I said, there was other things that came out of this conversation, but that was one thing that, yeah, I just didn't think about. And I think a lot of studios are often like looking to diversify how their studios are being used during the day. Because, you know, if you only have classes running from 4 p.m. onwards, there's a lot of hours where it's sitting empty. And so, you know, maybe you provide studio space for free, but maybe you just provide it at a super like reduced or reasonable rent for these other companies to be able to access and use. So that was, yeah, just interesting. And finally, I'm going to wrap up. There was, like I said, there was so much great stuff in this conference, and there was a lot of, yeah, sort of more kind of like social sciences. Like there was lots of presentations on mental health, and actually I might even do another podcast episode that's on this in the future, but studies looking at the mental health impacts of competitive dance on adolescent dancers. So things like that. There was looking at like sexualization of adolescent dancers, especially in competitive dance environments and stuff. So a lot of really, really great research. Some of those research studies like aren't completed yet, which is why I've not gone into them in a lot of detail. But the last thing I do want to talk about is the final session on the last day of the conference. And I felt like this was such a great way to wrap up the conference. There was I'm going to call it a workshop, because it wasn't really a panel discussion. I think it was billed as a panel, but it was more of a workshop. And the title of it was Interrogating the Role of Networks Toward Collective Change in Dance and Beyond. And then it had a subtitle, I think, Whose Interests Are We Serving? And it was really, really interesting, because when they're talking about networks, what they're talking about is a lot of these like organizations or associations or, you know, networking groups or whatever it is, and really looking at like what purpose do they serve, and who are we serving, and how effective can these organizations be? And so we ended up like breaking up into small groups, and there was some like brainstorming, and it was very much like a workshop. And I thought this was a really great session because it was super thought-provoking, but also over the course of the weekend, I had lots of conversations with various people at the conference talking about, or just like ranting about maybe is more accurate, in terms of how in the dance world, there's often so many people doing really, really good work, but in really individual silos. And so then somebody says, you know, I see this issue in the dance world, and whatever this issue is, so maybe the issue is, you know, the over-sexualization of dancers or whatever. It doesn't matter what the issue is, injury prevention, whatever. And rather than people maybe reaching out and connecting with other people or organizations or associations that are already doing that work, the trend in the dance world seems to be for people to think, okay, I'm going to start a network or an association or an organization or whatever you want to call it. And so what I feel like we have now is all of these really like hyper-focused organizations or like groups that are all trying to do really good work, but they're doing it in like a really siloed, isolated way, and not necessarily connecting with or talking with other organizations that are doing similar work. And that's not to say everyone needs to be a member of like one overarching organization, but at some point, these, you know, individual networks become a little bit ineffective when there just becomes so many of these almost like micro networks. So this session, although not aimed to give us concrete answers to anything like this, it was more of like a brainstorming, reflective type session. I thought it was a really timely workshop in terms of looking at especially like this idea of whose interests are we serving. So, you know, by creating all of these different associations and networks and whatever it is you want to call them, are we truly serving the dancers? Are we serving ourselves? Are we serving the larger dance community? Whose interests are we truly serving? Because I see it time and time again where, like I said, there's all these people doing really incredible work out there, but it's like everyone kind of wants to be doing it themselves as opposed to banding together and being more powerful as like a larger collective. Like I said, I had lots of conversations with individual people about similar things over the course of the weekend without even knowing that this was going to be the final session. And one of the things that sort of came out of some of those conversations was this idea that now with dance in a lot of places, especially in North America, being sort of competitive in nature, we've potentially lost a little bit of a sense of community. Like studios don't necessarily want to band together with other studios in their community because they see them as the competition, if that makes sense. And so it's become like every studio for themselves, every man for themselves. And that's almost seems to be like bleeding forward into these networks and associations and things like that. And, you know, that's probably an oversimplification of things, but it was very interesting and thought-provoking in terms of having a lot of these conversations over the course of the weekend. So I thought that was a great way of wrapping up the conference in terms of maybe leaving us with more questions than answers, but really just taking that away and thinking about that when we go back to our own local communities or when we're trying to advocate for change within the dance world or things like that. Like, how can we make sure that we're serving the interests of the people we're trying to be serving, and then also potentially creating more community within that as opposed to more of these kind of standalone networks that are then not connected to the larger community. So I thought that was a great place to wrap up. Like I said, it was a really good conference, super small and intimate on scale, but really high quality presentations and information and lots of good conversations that came out of it. So if you have never attended Healthy Dancer Canada before or don't know about the organization, especially if you are in Canada, but even, like I said, we have international members, I highly recommend checking it out. They have great resources that are available to members. And then, like I said, they put on a conference annually, and it is one of my favorite conferences because of its small, intimate nature. So definitely different than, you know, a large scale thing like IADMS, but I always leave Healthy Dancer Canada not feeling super overwhelmed, which is kind of how I often leave IADMS, but also just feeling really connected to the community. And so to me, that is the value in going to these conferences. If you have any questions or want to learn more about my experience there or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at Dance Physio Erika on social media platforms, or my email is also in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.